In August 2015, 4 months before The Force Awakens opened, J.J. Abrams sat with Empire magazine and said something that read, at the time, as a creative statement of intent. Kylo Ren isn't a Sith. Not a semantic quibble. In Star Wars mythology, Sith is a specific lineage, trained, initiated, bound by tradition stretching from Palpatine through Maul through Vader. Kylo Ren belongs to none of it. He works under Supreme Leader Snoke as a dark side disciple and carries Vader's iconography, not because he was made in that tradition, but because he chose it, personally and obsessively. The distinction is everything. Abrams was designing a character whose relationship to villainy was psychological rather than institutional. Not a Vader successor, a Vader fan. The fuller creative intention was this: I should imagine a journey of a character completely opposite to Darth Vader. Someone who starts as a child and becomes a man over the course of 3 movies. Vader enters A New Hope as a finished instrument. Black helmet, controlled menace, every scene confirming a character who has already completed his conversion to darkness, and now simply exercises it. Abrams wanted the precise inverse. A villain who begins fractured and either assembles himself or fails to across 3 chapters. An original premise for a franchise blockbuster villain, and one that required all 3 films to agree, in advance, on where that fracturing was supposed to go. They didn't coordinate. By December 2019, Kylo Ren, designed from the ground up as the opposite of Darth Vader, had been handed a redemption arc structurally identical to Darth Vader's, delivered in a 3rd film that was itself an improvised reconstruction of an abandoned 3rd film. The confession came from Abrams after the trilogy concluded. Esquire published the headline, "Abrams admits the obvious. Disney didn't have a real plan when they made the new Star Wars trilogy." His direct quote, "Having a plan, I have learned, in some cases, too late." Everything that follows is the evidence behind that admission. The defendant in this case isn't Rian Johnson, not Abrams personally. Both made defensible creative choices inside the walls of their individual films. The failure sits above either of them. No overarching plan, no story Bible, no shared architecture for where the trilogy's central character was going. 2 directors, eventually 3, pulling the same villain in different directions with no referee, and the character landing wherever that dynamic deposited him. That's what destroyed Kylo Ren as an original villain. Not any single decision, but the institutional vacuum that made individual decisions incoherent in combination. Start with the character as designed, because the prosecution has to establish what was lost before it can establish how it was lost. Kylo Ren didn't arrive at his final form easily. Before settling on the black-robed, cross-guard lightsaber design that reached theaters, the character cycled through concept iterations with names like the Jedi Killer and the Grave Robber. One design imagined him as the Lord of the Stormtroopers, silver armor, commanding military presence over the First Order. Kathleen Kennedy reportedly favored that design. Abrams rejected it. The silver aesthetic was repurposed into a separate character, Captain Phasma. The crossed-guard lightsaber, the cracked and patched helmet, the scorched black robes, all chosen specifically to evoke Vader while making visible, from the opening scene, that this was imitation rather than continuation. A disciple wearing a costume, not an inheritor wearing a mantle. That's not a small creative choice. It's the entire premise encoded into costume design. Vader's helmet is biological necessity. Without his life support suit, he survives open air for minutes at most. Every scene he appears in is a scene of a man kept alive by machinery. Kylo Ren is physically healthy. He wears the helmet because Vader wore one, which is a categorically different act. Academic analysis of The Force Awakens describes his villainy as worn in an amateurish, angsty, and conflicted fashion. The film's own language eventually endorses that reading. Snoke, in The Last Jedi, calls him a child in a mask. That line doesn't land as a taunt unless the film has spent an entire movie earning the observation. The scene that defines the character more precisely than any other isn't the opening of The Force Awakens, where he freezes a blaster bolt mid-air in a display of raw force power, though that's a striking introduction, presenting Kylo as someone operating at the outer edge of known ability. The definitive scene is the bridge inside Starkiller Base, midway through the film, when he removes the helmet to speak to Han Solo face to face. The helmet comes off, and what Abrams placed underneath, it's a young man who looks terrified. Not dominant, not certain, terrified. Han Solo stands there, using the name Kylo abandoned, Ben, and the audience watches someone fighting with himself in real time, in front of his father, unable to fully commit in either direction. Abrams told IGN that in those seconds, Solo was successfully convincing his son to turn from his evil ways, before the killing happened. Read that production note carefully. The scene is staged so that the dark side nearly loses. The killing happens from desperation, a man completing an act of darkness before his nerve fails and it becomes impossible. The killing isn't a triumph. It's a man trying to outrun his own better impulse. Adam Driver's account of what the act cost Kylo confirms it. He felt weaker after the killing, not stronger. And the scene doesn't allow him relief from the consequence. Chewbacca shoots him in the ribs with a bowcaster, a weapon that in the same film sends stormtroopers cartwheeling through the air. And Kylo Ren spends the next 20 minutes fighting Rey and Finn through snow and ice while bleeding from a massive wound. He barely wins that fight. He survives Finn's attack on his shoulder by centimeters. His final lightsaber exchange with Rey ends with her creating a ravine between them by force of will, because he can't press the advantage without collapsing. Abrams staged every beat of this sequence to communicate a man who has done the worst thing he could imagine and is immediately being punished for it. At no point does he have the situation under control. That was the design. The tantrum scenes make the same argument at lower stakes. When Kylo receives bad intelligence, the prisoner has escaped, Finn and the droid have taken to the freighter. He ignites his lightsaber and reduces the nearest equipment to scrap metal. Consoles shatter, sparks spray across the room, and the First Order technicians around him back away with the body language not of people fleeing a predator, but of people dealing with an unpredictable adolescent. This is the key distinction from Vader's anger. Vader's anger is cold, deliberate, and controlled. The choking of Admiral Ozzel in The Empire Strikes Back is the calm application of lethal force by someone in complete command of himself. He's barely looking at Ozzel while it happens. Kylo's rage is hot, impulsive, and embarrassing. He breaks things because he can't manage his own frustration. That's immaturity, not power, and Abrams staged it that way deliberately. The Vader helmet monologue sits at the center of all of this and carries the most thematic weight in the entire film. Kylo keeps the burned, mangled remains of Darth Vader's helmet, scorched from the funeral pyre on Endor, the black lacquer warped and cracked, the interior components fused into ruin, in his quarters aboard the finalizer, placed on a stand in what functions as a private meditation space. He addresses it directly. Finish what you started. A dark side spiritual pledge to the grandfather he has reconstructed into a saint. But the request reveals the delusion. Vader did finish what he started. He returned to the light side, died saving his son, received a Jedi's funeral. His arc ended in reconciliation. What Kylo is asking for is completion of an alternative Vader, the Vader who converts fully, destroys Palpatine, and wins on the dark side. And that Vader never existed. Kylo is worshipping a version of his grandfather that Vader himself rejected in his final minutes. He has built a saint from a sinner who repented, and he is praying to the version before the repentance. Built into that characterization is something unusual for a franchise blockbuster. A meta-commentary on the franchise itself. The Force Awakens arrived under enormous commercial and emotional pressure to honor the original trilogy, to feel continuous with it, to carry legacy characters with dignity, to satisfy 30 years of audience investment. Abrams built a villain whose entire catastrophe is that same pressure. Kylo Ren can't stop trying to honor a predecessor. He wears borrowed iconography because he has no stable identity of his own. He commits violence in service of an ideological inheritance that he didn't build and can't fully inhabit. He is, in Snoke's clinical diagnosis, a child in a mask. At the level of thematic design, Kylo Ren is the Force Awakens warning itself, and warning Lucasfilm, about what franchise filmmaking becomes when it's trapped by its own legacy. A creative enterprise so desperate to honor what came before that it destroys whatever is new in the attempt. Abrams built that warning into his own villain. For one film, the warning held. Then, the production structure ensured it wouldn't. Here is the evidence in this case that requires no interpretation, no analytical inference, no reading between lines. A physical fact about a physical prop, documented in the official licensed source material. In The Force Awakens, Kylo Ren removes his helmet before confronting Han Solo on Starkiller Base's bridge walkway. He is bareheaded during the confrontation. He is bareheaded when Han is killed. He is bareheaded when Chewbacca's bowcaster catches him in the ribs, and when he fights Finn and Rey in the snow-covered forest below. The helmet was left on the bridge infrastructure of Starkiller Base. Poe Dameron's strike run triggers the station's collapse and complete destruction. The base explodes. Wikipedia, the Star Wars fan wiki, sourced from licensed materials, states it directly and without equivocation. As Ren left his helmet on the bridge in Starkiller Base after killing Han Solo, it's never explained how Ren reacquired his helmet in The Last Jedi, considering Starkiller Base was destroyed. Never explained. The gap isn't addressed in the film. No novelization fills it. No supplementary comic or story material in the available record bridges it. No Rian Johnson interview or commentary track acknowledges the continuity break. The helmet simply reappears in The Last Jedi, as though the station hadn't exploded around it, as though it had been checked into storage somewhere and retrieved before filming began. What Johnson did with the helmet in TLJ is cinematically coherent in its own right. Snoke addresses Kylo as a child in a mask, the line functioning because the mask has been established as performance rather than necessity, and the humiliation is visceral. Later, Snoke's guards carry the helmet to Kylo, and he smashes it against the inside wall of a turbolift, shattering it against the metal. In a Screen Rant interview, Johnson said he was terrified to destroy the mask, to eliminate a visual icon that audiences had already responded to, but felt the narrative demanded it. His instinct about what the mask represented was correct. The mask was costume, and exposing it as costume was the right move. The execution simply contained a continuity gap that nobody appears to have registered before production began. The timing of Johnson's decision makes the gap more significant, not less. He made the call to destroy the helmet before The Force Awakens had even opened in theaters. He hadn't yet seen audience response to Kylo's mask. He hadn't resolved the physical logistics of how a prop left on an exploding space station would return in his film. He decided it needed to go, and proceeded. There is no documented public record of a conversation between Johnson and Abrams about where the helmet had been left at the end of TFA, what physical state it was in, or how its reappearance in TLJ would be explained. No continuity document tracking the prop between productions. No canonical bridge from a comic or novelization. The helmet reappeared because the story needed it. Kylo's scar provides a second data point in the same argument. He takes Rey's lightsaber across his face at the end of TFA. The wound runs diagonally from his right forehead toward his chin. In The Last Jedi, the scar has shifted to run more prominently over his eye. Johnson acknowledged this. His explanation was that he preferred the look. A character's facial scarring is precisely the kind of detail that exists on interproduction continuity sheets to prevent this kind of drift. That the position moved based on aesthetic preference and wasn't caught or corrected before filming suggests those sheets weren't functioning as binding documents between the two productions. Two continuity errors involving the same character's face and the same character's most recognizable prop. Neither one is catastrophic in isolation. Together, they are physical documentation of what production coordination failure looks like when it makes it to the screen. The helmet's full life cycle is the trilogy's production history in miniature. Introduced by Abrams and TFA with clear thematic intention, performance, not necessity, left on an exploding station, inexplicably retrieved to appear in TLJ, deliberately shattered by Johnson, then repaired by Abrams in Tross with red lacquer filling the cracks to signal recommitment to the dark side, then discarded permanently when Ben Solo's redemption completes. Introduced. Survived impossible destruction. Destroyed for the right thematic reasons, without continuity support. Rebuilt. Abandoned. Each event driven by narrative need in the individual film, with no apparent accounting for what the prior film had established. A prop with a more chaotic trajectory than the character wearing it. The most contested terrain in any discussion of The Last Jedi is Luke Skywalker, and an honest analytical case starts from the strongest version of the defense. 30 years separate the Battle of Endor from the events of TLJ. Luke, at the end of Return of the Jedi, is 23 years old, a newly minted Jedi Knight who has just witnessed his father's redemption and death. By The Last Jedi, he's in his late 50s. In the decades between, he rebuilt the Jedi Order, trained a new generation, and identified his most promising student in his nephew Ben Solo. Then, by Luke's own account in the film, he ignited his lightsaber over a sleeping Ben, driven by a flash of preemptive terror at what he sensed growing in the boy. That single impulse led directly to Ben destroying the school, killing the other students, and dismantling everything Luke had spent decades building. A man who caused catastrophe through his own worst impulse, who watched the monster he accidentally helped create murder his students, has a coherent psychological reason to exile himself from the Force and refuse to return. The argument that Luke would simply regroup and push forward projects heroic narrative expectation onto what might be genuine traumatic collapse. Johnson's TLJ. Luke isn't psychologically incoherent. The problem is Mark Hamill. Hamill spent 40 years with this character's interior logic, across multiple trilogies, across animated series, across decades of press cycles and fan conventions. His disagreement with Johnson's version is documented across multiple interviews, consistent over years, and specific enough to constitute professional characterization dispute rather than fan disappointment. In a Collider interview, his verdict was direct. Maybe he's Jake Skywalker, he's not my Luke Skywalker. He described the conversation with Johnson precisely. I said to Ryan, Jedis don't give up. I mean, even if Luke had a problem, he would maybe take a year to try and regroup. But if he made a mistake, he would try and right that wrong. So right there, we had a fundamental difference. On ABC's Nightline in April 2018, he stated he fundamentally disagreed with virtually everything Johnson had drawn up for the character. Not offhand remarks in a single interview. Consistent, specific, documented judgments from the person with the deepest institutional knowledge of who Luke Skywalker is supposed to be. Hamill later said he regretted making those doubts public. He subsequently noted there's no hostility between him and Johnson, and that his earlier statements required more context than they received in isolation. But regret for disclosure doesn't revise what was disclosed. His most clarifying sentence, the one that names the actual mechanism, was this. It's not my story anymore. It's somebody else's story, and Ryan needed me to be a certain way to make the ending effective. That sentence is the institutional argument stated plainly. Johnson designed a specific ending, the crate projection, Luke's forced sacrifice that buys the Resistance's escape, the death that follows that final act of defiance, and constructed a version of Luke capable of arriving there. TLJ's Luke is built for a specific third-act payoff. His characterization is engineered backward from the conclusion Johnson needed, not developed forward from the trajectory The Force Awakens had established. It's worth noting that Hamill also expressed some disappointment with how he'd been handled in TFA. His removal from the story until the final seconds, his minimal narrative function in the film he'd been promised would reunite the original cast. His frustrations weren't exclusively Johnson's problem. That detail deepens the institutional argument rather than complicating it. Luke's characterization was being improvised across the trilogy, with each director building the Luke their film required, rather than managing a continuous shared version. This matters directly for Kylo because the structural cause is identical. Johnson needed specific versions of both characters to make The Last Jedi work as a standalone film. His TLJ Kylo is more composed, more commanding, more compelling as a standalone anti-hero than TFA's desperate, wound-bleeding, mask-wearing adolescent trying and failing to be Vader. The Force bond with Rey, the throne room offer to rule together, the Supreme Leader pivot, these are genuinely strong character developments. They're also not fully continuous with the character Abrams designed, because no shared document established which version of Kylo was authoritative across the trilogy. Johnson built the Kylo his film needed. Abrams had built the Kylo his film needed. The two are meaningfully different people. The averaged result of those two incompatible visions is what appeared on screen. A character with two distinct psychological registers across 3 films. Desperate and unformed in TFA, composed and threatening in TLJ, then partially reset towards something resembling the TFA version for Tross's final arc. Averaging doesn't function as character development. It functions as evidence that no single arc was ever planned. The throne room sequence in The Last Jedi is one of the trilogy's genuinely effective surprises. Kylo, seated beside Rey before Snoke, has quietly used the Force to reorient her lightsaber, while Snoke reads minds and misreads the geometry of the deception. The blade ignites. The villain is bisected mid-monologue, mid-confidence. The Praetorian Guard sequence that follows is impressively staged, a 2-on-8 fight in a burning throne room using improvised weapons and physics that stretch but don't quite break the universe's internal rules. Inside The Last Jedi, as a narrative beat, it functions. As a trilogy-level decision, it created a structural hole that the third film couldn't cleanly fill. Snoke in The Force Awakens is established through presentation as the senior authority in the dark side hierarchy. Disfigured in ways that imply a long and violent history the film deliberately withholds, projecting via massive hologram that towers over every other figure in the room, receiving Kylo Ren's deference with body language that communicates genuine fear rather than political performance. Everything about Snoke's construction in TFA is built to invite questions. Where did he come from? What is his relationship to the Sith tradition, if any? How did he find and corrupt Ben Solo? What does he want beyond the First Order's military campaign? In serialized storytelling, those questions are implicit promises. You establish a mystery, the audience carries it to the next installment, expecting eventual explanation. Standard contractual practice. Johnson declined to provide any of it. No backstory for Snoke, no origin, no explanation of his dark side capacity or his history with the Solo Skywalker family. The character who had functioned as the trilogy's senior antagonist for an entire film was killed in the second act of the second film, with every mystery still intact. Per a V Club reporting on Johnson's public statements, he described Snoke's death as essentially the driving narrative development of the entire story. His goal was to free Kylo from his master's shadow, so Kylo could become his own character, the story's true protagonist-antagonist. That logic is coherent inside The Last Jedi. It doesn't hold at the trilogy level, because killing the senior villain without explanation left the Rise of Skywalker with no credible antagonist above Kylo, now Supreme Leader of the First Order, and no established dark-side figure capable of threatening him. Kylo has already surpassed and killed his master. A Supreme Leader without an adversary above him has no natural dramatic ceiling. The story Abrams established in TFA required a villain hierarchy with room above Kylo for escalation. Johnson collapsed that hierarchy in his film's second act. Abrams' solution for Tross was Palpatine. Ian McDiarmid's return was announced publicly at D23 before the film released. The movie opens with a planetary broadcast from Palpatine, transmitted beyond death. The dead speak, in the novelization's phrasing, and the opening crawl's elliptical reference to his return became the trilogy's most widely discussed single sentence, widely mocked for its vagueness. The Tross novelization by Ray Carson eventually explains that Palpatine had mastered death and came back to life, which covers the mechanical question. It can't address the structural one. Palpatine's defeat in Return of the Jedi was conclusive. thrown down a reactor shaft by the sun he tried to corrupt, destroyed in the explosion of the second Death Star. Reintroducing him in the final chapter of a trilogy that had spent 2 films establishing entirely different villain architecture isn't organic storytelling. It's emergency narrative design, made visible by how hard the film works to justify something that should have been prepared for. The decision to bring Palpatine back was Abrams's. This matters. It wasn't part of Colin Trevorrow's approach. Trevorrow had been hired to direct Episode 9 after The Last Jedi. He wrote a script titled Duel of the Fates, with its own villain architecture. He was fired from the project in September 2017, confirmed, with reporting describing the production aftermath as chaotic and messy. Abrams was brought back to replace him. 3 months earlier, in June 2017, Phil Lord and Chris Miller had been fired from Solo, a Star Wars story, after weeks of already shot footage, replaced by Ron Howard, who then reshot the majority of the film. 2 productions, 3 months apart, each ending with a directorial removal and an emergency replacement. The pattern reaches back to the beginning of the sequel era. When Disney acquired Lucasfilm in October 2012, George Lucas had prepared sequel trilogy treatments as part of the sale, his own vision for where the saga would go after Return of the Jedi. Lucasfilm, under Kathleen Kennedy, declined to use those treatments as the foundation for the new films. A defensible creative decision. Lucas acknowledged he isn't always the most reliable narrator of his own intentions, and his prequel trilogy had generated its own contested reception. But declining Lucas's treatments without replacing them with an equivalent plan left the creative direction of the trilogy wide open. It had to be built from scratch, film by film, director by director, without an architectural spine to work from. The story group at Lucasfilm was established to provide continuity oversight across Star Wars media, to function as the shared authority that prevented contradictions between films, novels, comics, and games. For the sequel trilogy specifically, there is no evidence in the public record that this group served as a binding creative authority between productions. Johnson made continuity decisions about Kylo's helmet, Kylo's scar, and Snoke's fate that contradicted or foreclosed Abrams' TFA setups without documented interdepartmental correction. The story group either wasn't consulted on these decisions, wasn't empowered to enforce corrections, or wasn't functioning as a cross-production coordinator between TFA and TLJ's creative teams. No Lucas treatments. No shared story Bible. No plan established before a single camera rolled on TFA for where the trilogy would land 3 films later. Abrams confirmed this institutional vacuum in the clearest terms available. Post-trilogy, speaking to Esquire, admitting that not having a plan was a lesson he'd learned, in some cases, too late. The admission is extraordinary in its specificity. Not, we adjusted the plan as we went. Not, we made bold creative choices. He's describing the absence of a plan as a mistake with consequences. Those consequences are measurable. The Force Awakens generated approximately $2 billion worldwide. The Rise of Skywalker landed at approximately half that figure. The Last Jedi sat between them on a clear downward slope. The audience score on Rotten Tomatoes for The Last Jedi registered at 43%, against a critic score of approximately 91%, one of the widest audience-to-critic divergences in the history of wide-release franchise blockbusters. Whatever critics responded to in TLJ's formal ambition and thematic risk-taking, the paying audience across 3 films was expressing something different through declining engagement. A trajectory that drops from $2 billion to $1 billion across 3 entries in a franchise with the marketing apparatus and built-in audience base of Star Wars is the aggregate audience response to a story that lost its coherence over time. The Rise of Skywalker presents Ben Solo's redemption in a sequence of beats that are individually recognizable as belonging to the correct genre of story. Each arrives at the appropriate structural moment. Each performs its assigned narrative function. The aggregate experience, for an audience that had been watching since 2015, is of a checklist completing itself. A story shaped correctly from the outside, but missing the momentum that 4 years of serialized investment should have generated. The mechanics are precise. Kylo hunts Rey through Troza's first act, wearing his repaired, red-lacquered helmet. The damage from the turbolift scene, filled with color, that signals recommitment to darkness. A visual statement about where he believes himself to be. They fight on the wreckage of the second Death Star above a storm-churned ocean, waves breaking across the ruins of the station that killed Palpatine and Vader both. Abrams shooting this on a location dense with the franchise's own history, which is either meaningful visual design or heavy-handed reminder, depending on the viewer. Rey impales him. Then, in a moment of unexpected grace, heals the wound before departing. That healing is the hinge of his arc. She does something costly and generous to someone who is trying to kill her, and it lands because Driver plays Kylo's subsequent stillness with genuine bewilderment. A man who hasn't been met with mercy in so long, he's lost the ability to process it. Leia dies. Kylo feels it across the Force, the last thread of family he had remaining, severed. Then the Han Solo scene. Abrams described it not as a Force ghost. Han Solo had no Force ability in life, and no established mechanism for appearing after death as an apparition, but as Ben's own memory of his father, externalized at the moment of maximum psychological crisis. The memory says, "I know." 2 words, an echo of the bridge on Starkiller Base, of the franchise's most famous exchange. Ben Solo throws his lightsaber into the ocean. The problem with this sequence isn't that it's poorly constructed, it's that it's constructed entirely within Troz. The emotional weight it needs requires continuity going back through all 3 films, a sustained portrait of someone capable of this reversal, built over 4 years and 3 chapters. What the audience has instead is an arc that Driver himself confirmed was overhauled mid-production. Abrams had walked Driver through what he wanted to do with the character at the beginning of the trilogy, the 3-film journey of someone completely opposite to Darth Vader. That arc wasn't what arrived on screen. Driver's account of that divergence, as reported, cuts off before full elaboration, but the essential fact is established. The actor playing the character across all 3 films watched the character's intended trajectory change underneath him between productions. Ben Solo fights alongside Rey against Palpatine's guards on Exegol. Palpatine blasts him into a chasm with Force lightning that should be fatal. He crawls back up the cliff face. When Palpatine drains Rey's life force completely, Ben Solo pours his own Force energy into her, an act of restoration that costs him his life. She wakes up. He smiles. He dissolves into the Force. Abrams closes the loop. The healing Rey gave him on the Death Star wreckage returned at the cost of everything he has left. It's a formally correct narrative echo. It's also structurally identical to Darth Vader dying in Luke's arms at the end of Return of the Jedi. The conflicted villain finally choosing the light at the last possible moment, sacrificing himself to save the person he loves, dissolving into the Force, leaving the hero alone. The ending Abrams designed for the character whose original design principle was that he wasn't Darth Vader, is Darth Vader's ending. That's not a coincidence. It's what happens when a character built for an original 3-film journey loses its shared architectural direction midway through. The default shape for a conflicted villain in Star Wars is the Vader shape. It's what the franchise trained audiences to expect across 4 decades, what Lucasfilm knows how to execute, what feels narratively complete in the absence of a more original destination. Without a coordinated plan establishing where Kylo Ren was going, the path of least narrative resistance was the one that already existed, Vader's shape. Given the helmet Kylo wore, the grandfather he worshipped, the family he carried, the gravitational pull of that shape was always going to be enormous. Resisting it required a plan. There wasn't one. The repaired helmet is the visual summary of the entire production dynamic. Johnson shattered it in TLJ to signal that Kylo was done with performative villainy, the costume exposed as just a costume. Abrams rebuilt it in TROS because he needed the Kylo Ren image for the film's opening arc, then had Ben Solo abandon it permanently when the redemption completes. story reasons were applied to a prop decision made by production necessity. The object that most clearly expressed Kylo's original characterization, worn by choice, not necessity, signal of a man who chose to be Vader rather than himself, became a prop cycled through 3 films by the logic of who needed it at which moment, surviving an explosion it shouldn't have survived along the way. Here is the tragic irony the trilogy built by accident, and it sharpens the more carefully you examine it. Kylo Ren's entire characterization was built around a single pathology, a man so desperate to honor a legacy he can't escape that he destroys whatever is original in himself trying to inhabit it. He wears Vader's mask without Vader's necessity. He addresses Vader's burned helmet like a shrine. He commits the worst act of his life, trying to sever the last thread connecting him to Ben Solo, only to find that severing it made him weaker, not stronger. Every decision Kylo makes in The Force Awakens is the decision of someone who can't stop looking backward into someone else's shadow, can't stop measuring himself against a predecessor he has mythologized into something unattainable. Lucasfilm, across the production of this trilogy, did the same thing. So invested in honoring George Lucas's legacy, in feeling continuous with the films that made the franchise, they built a sequel trilogy without coordinating where it was going. Lucas's own treatments for the sequel era were set aside. No equivalent architecture replaced them. Each director made the film they needed to make, built the characters they needed for their film to work, and moved on. The result? The trilogy's most original element, its villain, defaulted by the 3rd film to the most familiar shape available. Not despite the franchise's investment in its own past, because of it. The films became Kylo Ren. So determined to finish what someone else started that they couldn't build something of their own. What makes this genuinely painful, rather than simply frustrating, is that the raw material for something better was present in The Force Awakens. A villain who was unformed, conflicted, desperate, and original in exactly the way franchise villains rarely are. A character who wore Vader's face while the film quietly pointed out that this was pathology rather than inheritance. A psychological portrait, the Vader worship, the killing from weakness, the tantrums as failure of control, that had genuine depth and somewhere genuinely original to go across 3 coordinated films. Adam Driver was doing extraordinary work with it. The meta-commentary was alive and pointed. The warning was built into the villain's own story. It required coordination to protect. A plan. A shared document establishing where Ben Solo was going, what his arc looked like across all 3 films, what the original Kylo Ren premise resolved into before a single camera rolled on Episode 8. Instead, 2 directors, and eventually 3, worked on him in sequence, without shared architecture, and the character ended his trilogy dying to save the woman he loved, dissolving into the Force, having redeemed himself at the last possible moment in the final minutes of the final film. Vader's arc, in Vader's franchise, wearing Vader's borrowed face. Abrams said it himself, having a plan I have learned, in some cases, too late. They had something new. What they built toward, in the end, was old. If you want more stories like this, the gap between what something could have been and what it became, subscribe.